The school counselor told me my daughter's panic attacks are just her being dramatic for attention. Mrs. Grayson called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was in a budget meeting. Your daughter, Lily, had another episode in the hallway today. She was hyperventilating and crying and causing quite a scene. I've spoken with her and I'm confident this is attention-seeking behavior. She needs to understand that we can't accommodate dramatics every time she feels a little stressed. I left work immediately and drove to Westfield High School. Found my 15-year-old daughter sitting in the counselor's office with red eyes and shaking hands. Mrs. Grayson stood by her desk with her arms crossed. Lily, tell your father what we discussed, about how you're going to handle your emotions more appropriately from now on. My daughter looked at the floor and said nothing. Her hands trembled in her lap. I asked what happened, and Mrs. Grayson sighed heavily. She was walking to fourth period and apparently started having difficulty breathing. Got herself all worked up. The teacher called me and I came to talk her down. This is the third time this month. I looked at Lily and saw genuine terror in her eyes. This wasn't drama. This was something real. I told Mrs. Grayson we were leaving and I'd be taking Lily to see a doctor. She rolled her eyes. That's exactly what she wants. Attention and time out of class. You're reinforcing the behavior. I took Lily to the emergency room because her breathing still hadn't normalized. The doctor examined her thoroughly and asked questions about what triggered the episode. Lily wouldn't answer, just stared at the wall and picked at her cuticles until they bled. The doctor pulled me aside and said this looked like a severe anxiety response or possibly PTSD. He recommended immediate follow-up with a psychiatrist and gave us referrals. On the drive home, I tried to talk to Lily, but she stayed silent. When we got inside, she went straight to her room and locked the door. I stood in the hallway listening to her cry and felt helpless. That night, I researched panic attacks and PTSD in teenagers. Everything I read said these were serious mental health conditions, not attention-seeking dramatics. The symptoms matched exactly what I'd witnessed. Rapid breathing, trembling, inability to speak, overwhelming fear. The articles stressed the importance of identifying triggers and getting professional help immediately. I made an appointment with the psychiatrist for the next available slot, which was the following Monday. I called the school Friday morning to inform them Lily would be absent while we addressed her medical needs. The receptionist transferred me to Mrs. Grayson, who answered with obvious irritation in her voice. Missing school will only make this worse. She needs to learn to cope with normal teenage stress. I explained that the emergency room doctor had recommended psychiatric evaluation and that we were treating this as a serious medical issue. Mrs. Grayson laughed. These doctors will diagnose anything if you push hard enough. I've been a school counselor for 18 years. I know the difference between genuine mental health crises and teenage girls who want attention. Lily is a bright girl who's discovered that having a breakdown gets her out of class and gets everyone focused on her. If you continue to enable this behavior, you'll create a pattern that follows her into adulthood. I felt anger rising in my chest. My daughter was terrified. She couldn't breathe. That's not performance. Mrs. Grayson's voice turned cold. I've seen hundreds of teenage girls go through this phase. They all grow out of it once they realize the dramatics don't work. The best thing you can do is insist she attend class and face her responsibilities. Coddling her sends the wrong message. I told her I'd bring medical documentation when Lily returned to school and hung up before I said something I'd regret. Lily stayed home Friday, barely ate, barely spoke, just lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. The psychiatrist appointment on Monday changed everything. Dr. Keegan was a woman in her 50s who specialized in adolescent trauma. She spent 2 hours with Lily alone while I waited in the lobby. When she finally called me in, her expression was grave. Lily is experiencing severe post-traumatic stress. She's had multiple panic attacks triggered by something specific at school. She was able to identify the trigger during our session, but she's terrified to tell you or anyone else what happened. I asked what the trigger was, and Dr. Keegan said she needed Lily's permission to share details. She brought Lily back into the office, and my daughter sat in the chair gripping the armrests with white knuckles. Dr. Keegan spoke gently. Lily, your father needs to know what happened so he can help keep you safe. Can you tell him, or would you like me to explain? Lily started crying and shook her head. Dr. Keegan looked at me and her voice was carefully controlled. Lily disclosed that she was sexually assaulted by a substitute teacher at Westfield High approximately 6 weeks ago. The panic attacks began shortly after. She's been triggered every time she sees this teacher in the building. I felt the room tilt. My daughter had been assaulted at school, and I hadn't known. Dr. Keegan continued explaining that Lily had tried to report the incident to Mrs. Grayson the day after it happened. The counselor had told her that what she described didn't sound like assault, just a misunderstanding. That accusing a teacher of inappropriate behavior was serious, and she needed to be absolutely certain before making such claims. Mrs. Grayson had suggested Lily was confused about normal teacher-student interactions, and that her feelings were probably just embarrassment over something innocent. Lily had left that meeting believing she'd somehow caused the problem or misinterpreted what happened. The shame and fear had been building for 6 weeks. Every panic attack happened on days when she saw the substitute teacher in the hallway or cafeteria. Dr. Keegan handed me documentation including her diagnostic assessment, treatment recommendations, and a detailed report of Lily's disclosure. This needs to be reported to the police immediately. The substitute teacher is a danger to other students. and the school counselor's response to Lily's initial report was completely inappropriate and potentially illegal. She had a mandatory reporting obligation that she failed to fulfill. I drove straight to the police station from Dr. Keegan's office with Lily and the documentation. The detective who took our report was a woman named Officer Brennan. She listened carefully while Lily described what the substitute teacher had done, how he'd asked her to stay after class to discuss her grade, how he'd touched her inappropriately and made comments about her appearance, how she'd frozen and couldn't speak or move, how she'd felt dirty and scared ever since. Officer Brennan took detailed notes and assured Lily she was brave for coming forward. She explained that they'd investigate immediately and would need to interview Mrs. Grayson about why she didn't report the disclosure. I mentioned the panic attacks being dismissed as attention-seeking, and Officer Brennan's expression hardened. That counselor should have called us the moment your daughter reported an assault. Instead, she gaslit a traumatized 15-year-old and left a predator in a school full of children. She made calls while we sat in her office. Within an hour, 2 other detectives had been assigned to the case. They went to Westfield High to interview staff and students. Officer Brennan said someone would contact me about next steps. The school didn't call me. I called them Wednesday morning after hearing nothing for 2 days. The receptionist transferred me to Dr. Fleming, the principal. He sounded defensive immediately. Mrs. Grayson informed me of your allegations. I want you to know that we take all concerns seriously, but we also have to be careful about rushing to judgment. The substitute teacher you're accusing has an excellent record and has never had any complaints. Your daughter's history of attention-seeking behavior makes this a complicated situation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My daughter has PTSD from being sexually assaulted by a member of your staff. She reported it to your counselor 6 weeks ago, and nothing was done. Now she's being blamed for having panic attacks because seeing her assailant in the building traumatizes her. Dr. Fleming's voice got quieter. I understand you believe your daughter. However, Mrs. Grayson assessed the situation at the time and determined it didn't meet the threshold for a formal report. She used her professional judgment based on 18 years of experience working with adolescents. I asked if he was serious, if he really thought a school counselor could decide not to report a student's disclosure of sexual assault. Dr. Fleming cleared his throat. I'm not a lawyer, but I trust my staff's judgment. Mrs. Grayson felt your daughter was confused. I contacted a lawyer that afternoon. David Sterling specialized in education law and institutional abuse cases. He reviewed all my documentation, and his face grew increasingly angry as he read. The school had a legal obligation to report this to Child Protective Services and law enforcement immediately. The counselor's failure to report is a crime. The principal's defense of that failure makes him complicit. This is exactly the kind of institutional cover-up that allows predators to continue harming children. He explained that we could file a civil suit against the district for negligence and for violating Lily's rights under Title IX. He also said the criminal investigation would proceed separately. He'd seen cases where schools prioritized their reputation over student safety, and it made him furious every time. We signed a retainer agreement, and David said he'd start by demanding all records related to the substitute teacher, including any previous complaints. That evening, Officer Brennan called with an update. They'd interviewed several staff members and students. 3 other girls had come forward saying they'd also been made uncomfortable by the substitute teacher. 2 of them had experienced inappropriate touching. Both had reported concerns to Mrs. Grayson. Both were told they were misinterpreting friendly behavior and needed to be more mature about interactions with authority figures. David filed a public records request for all documentation related to the substitute teacher, whose name was Gregory Thornton. He'd been working as a substitute in the district for 3 years. The district delayed responding to the records request, claiming they needed time to review what could be released. David filed a motion to compel. While we waited, Officer Brennan's investigation expanded. They'd identified 5 students total who reported inappropriate behavior by Thornton. All 5 had gone to Mrs. Grayson. All 5 were told they were overreacting, attention-seeking, or misunderstanding normal interactions. Mrs. Grayson had documented each girl's complaint in her files as adolescent drama, or attention-seeking behavior, or misinterpretation of friendly adult interaction. She never reported any of it to authorities. Officer Brennan obtained a warrant for Thornton's arrest on multiple counts of sexual assault and child abuse. They arrested him on a Monday morning at his apartment. The news ran a story that evening about a substitute teacher at Westfield High being charged with assaulting students. My phone started ringing immediately. Other parents wanting to know details, wanting to know if their daughters were safe, wanting to know why they hadn't been informed earlier. The school board called an emergency meeting for that Thursday evening. The auditorium was packed with parents demanding answers. Dr. Fleming sat at the front table with Mrs. Grayson and several board members. The board president tried to calm everyone down, but parents were shouting. A woman stood up in the 3rd row. My daughter told me she went to Mrs. Grayson last year about Mr. Thornton making her uncomfortable. The counselor told her she was being overdramatic and that she needed to learn to handle normal stress without falling apart. My daughter started having panic attacks. I was told she was attention-seeking, that she needed discipline, not accommodation. Another mother stood up. Same thing happened to my daughter. She reported being touched inappropriately. Mrs. Grayson told her she was confused and that she'd get the teacher in trouble over nothing if she kept talking about it. My daughter developed anxiety so severe she started cutting herself. I brought her to therapy, and Mrs. Grayson told me I was enabling attention-seeking behavior. The room erupted in angry voices. Parents turning to each other, realizing their daughters had all been dismissed by the same counselor. Board members looked at each other with growing alarm. Dr. Fleming tried to speak, but parents shouted him down. David stood up and addressed the board directly. I represent the family whose daughter first came forward to police about Gregory Thornton's assaults. We now know that at least 5 students reported concerning behavior to Mrs. Grayson over a 2-year period. She failed to report any of it to authorities as required by law. She documented these disclosures as attention-seeking drama and told traumatized children they were making things up. The district continued employing Thornton despite multiple red flags. This is systematic failure at every level. The board president tried to respond, but David continued. Every parent in this room should know that mandatory reporting laws exist specifically to prevent what happened here. When a child discloses abuse to a school employee, that employee must report it immediately. They don't get to use their judgment about whether they believe the child. Mrs. Grayson broke the law repeatedly. Dr. Fleming defended her actions, and Gregory Thornton assaulted more children because the people responsible for protecting them chose to protect the institution instead. Parents started demanding Mrs. Grayson's resignation. The board president banged his gavel and called for order. He announced they'd be conducting a full investigation, and appropriate action would be taken. Parents weren't satisfied with that response. They wanted immediate consequences. I stood up and walked to the microphone in the center aisle. My hands shook, but my voice came out steady. 6 weeks ago, my 15-year-old daughter was sexually assaulted by Gregory Thornton. The next day, she reported it to Mrs. Grayson. The counselor told her she was confused and attention-seeking. For 6 weeks, my daughter has been having severe panic attacks, triggered by seeing her assailant in the school hallways. Mrs. Grayson called me repeatedly to complain about my daughter's dramatics. She told me I was enabling bad behavior. She never mentioned that my daughter had disclosed an assault. She never reported it to authorities. My daughter developed PTSD because the adult who was supposed to help her chose to protect a predator instead. The auditorium went completely silent. I pulled out the documentation from my bag. I have the psychiatric evaluation diagnosing my daughter with PTSD. I have the police report documenting her assault. I have Mrs. Grayson's own notes calling my daughter attention-seeking. And I have statements from 4 other families whose daughters went through the same thing. I walked to the board table and set the papers in front of the president. How many children had to be assaulted before someone decided to listen? The board went into executive session for 40 minutes while parents waited in the auditorium. People formed clusters, talking in angry whispers. 3 other mothers approached me and said their daughters had also reported concerns about Thornton to Mrs. Grayson. None had known about the others until tonight. When the board returned, the president looked shaken. Based on preliminary review of the evidence presented tonight, Mrs. Grayson is being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Dr. Fleming is also being placed on administrative leave for his failure to properly respond when these concerns were brought to his attention. The board will be retaining an independent investigator to review all personnel files and student records related to this matter. Parents erupted in applause, but I felt exhausted rather than vindicated. My daughter was still traumatized. 4 other girls were still suffering. Thornton had assaulted children who could have been protected if anyone had done their jobs. The board president continued explaining that they'd be implementing new training and reporting procedures, that they took student safety seriously. The words felt hollow. They'd taken safety seriously only after being forced to by public exposure and legal threats. If I hadn't pushed, if the police hadn't investigated, Mrs. Grayson would still be counseling students and Thornton might still be working in schools. David filed the civil suit the following Monday. The complaint detailed every failure by Mrs. Grayson and Dr. Fleming, named the district as a defendant for negligent supervision and failure to protect students, demanded compensatory damages for Lily's trauma and punitive damages to punish the institutional failures. The local news covered the filing, and suddenly reporters were calling constantly. I gave one interview explaining that this wasn't about money. It was about forcing institutional change so no other child had to experience what Lily went through. The district's lawyer filed a response denying liability and claiming Mrs. Grayson had acted within the scope of her professional judgment. David immediately filed a motion to compel production of all documents related to mandatory reporting training and policies. The district had 30 days to respond. During this time, Officer Brennan's criminal investigation wrapped up. They'd gathered statements from all 5 victims, reviewed Mrs. Grayson's notes documenting each disclosure she'd dismissed, and built a case not just against Thornton, but against Mrs. Grayson herself. The district attorney filed charges against Mrs. Grayson for failure to report suspected child abuse, a misdemeanor that carried potential jail time and mandatory reporting violations. Mrs. Grayson's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA refused. They wanted this case to go to trial to send a message about mandatory reporting obligations. Lily continued therapy with Dr. Keegan twice a week. Slowly, she started improving. The panic attacks became less frequent once she knew Thornton had been arrested and she wouldn't see him at school. But she still struggled with trust and shame and anger at the adults who'd failed her. Dr. Keegan explained this was normal trauma response and recovery would take time. I'd taken leave from work to focus on Lily's needs. My employer was supportive, but I worried about finances. David assured me that the civil case would likely settle before trial, and we'd recover damages. For now, he said, focus on Lily's healing. The preliminary hearing for Thornton's criminal case happened in November. All 5 victims had to testify about what he'd done. Lily was terrified, but Dr. Keegan helped her prepare. I sat in the courtroom and watched my daughter describe the assault with shaking hands. Thornton's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she'd wanted attention, and made false accusations. The judge shut that down immediately, and ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The independent investigator hired by the school board completed her report in December. The findings were devastating. Mrs. Grayson had a pattern spanning 7 years of dismissing student reports of concerning behavior by staff members. She'd documented at least 12 separate instances where students reported inappropriate conduct, and she'd labeled them as attention-seeking or dramatic without investigating further. 3 of those reports involved Thornton. The other 9 involved 2 different teachers who'd both since left the district. The investigator concluded that Mrs. Grayson had prioritized avoiding conflict and protecting staff over student safety. She'd failed to follow mandatory reporting protocols in every case. Dr. Fleming had been made aware of concerns about Mrs. Grayson's approach to student disclosures at least twice in the previous 3 years. Staff members had raised concerns that she wasn't taking reports seriously. He'd dismissed those concerns and told staff to trust Mrs. Grayson's professional judgment. The report recommended termination of both Mrs. Grayson and Dr. Fleming and complete overhaul of reporting procedures. The school board voted unanimously to terminate both. Mrs. Grayson's teaching license was also suspended pending review by the state licensing board. Thornton's trial began in February. The prosecution presented testimony from all 5 victims describing assaults that followed the same pattern. Thornton would ask girls to stay after class, would make comments about their appearance, would touch them inappropriately under the guise of friendly gestures. The prosecution also called Mrs. Grayson as a witness. She had to explain under oath why she documented each disclosure as attention-seeking rather than reporting to authorities. Her attorney had advised her to plead the 5th, but the prosecutor had granted her immunity for her testimony in exchange for her cooperation against Thornton. Mrs. Grayson testified that she'd truly believed the girls were exaggerating or misinterpreting normal interactions, that she'd seen so many teenage girls create drama over nothing that she'd become skeptical of their reports, that she'd thought she was helping them learn to handle normal adult relationships. The prosecutor asked if she understood that mandatory reporting laws didn't include exceptions for skepticism. Mrs. Grayson admitted she knew she was required to report, but had convinced herself these situations didn't rise to that level. The jury convicted Thornton on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mrs. Grayson's criminal trial happened in March. The charges were misdemeanor failure to report, but the case drew significant attention. The prosecution argued that her repeated failures had enabled a predator to continue assaulting children. Her defense attorney argued that she'd made judgment errors, but hadn't acted with criminal intent. The jury took 4 hours to convict her on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 6 months in jail and 3 years probation. During sentencing, the judge said Mrs. Grayson had violated the sacred trust parents place in school employees, that her actions had caused immeasurable harm to children who'd been brave enough to come forward, that she'd failed at the most basic responsibility of protecting vulnerable students. I sat in the courtroom with 3 other parents whose daughters had been victims. We'd formed a support group and had been attending each other's legal proceedings. When the sentence was read, we held hands and some of us cried. It wasn't enough time for the damage she'd caused, but it was accountability. Our civil case against the district settled in April. They agreed to pay substantial damages to Lily and the 4 other victims. More importantly, they agreed to implement comprehensive mandatory reporting training for all staff, create an independent reporting hotline for students, and establish oversight procedures to ensure reports were properly handled. Lily returned to school in January at a different district where nobody knew her history. She was still in therapy, but her panic attacks had decreased significantly. She'd made new friends and was slowly rebuilding her confidence. Some days were harder than others, but she was healing. Dr. Keegan said her prognosis was good with continued support. The other 4 victims were also getting help and recovering at their own pace. We stayed in touch, our families connected by shared trauma and the fight for justice. The state licensing board revoked Mrs. Grayson's counseling license permanently in May. She'd never work with children again. David helped us establish a foundation with part of the settlement money to provide legal advocacy for other families facing institutional failures around abuse reporting. We partnered with advocacy organizations to push for stronger mandatory reporting laws and better training for school staff. I spoke at several conferences about our experience and the importance of believing children who come forward. Every time I told Lily's story, I saw recognition in other parents' faces. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that played out in schools across the country whenever institutions prioritized reputation over student safety. 2 years after everything began, Lily graduated from therapy. Dr. Keegan said she'd developed healthy coping mechanisms and processed her trauma. She'd always carry those scars, but they no longer controlled her life. She was 17 now, thinking about colleges, making plans for her future. Some days I looked at her and marveled at her strength. She'd survived assault, institutional betrayal, and a legal process that forced her to relive her trauma repeatedly. She'd come through it stronger than before, though I wished she'd never had to face any of it. The foundation we'd established had helped 12 other families navigate similar situations. We'd connected parents with lawyers, provided funding for therapy, and advocated for policy changes in several districts. The work felt meaningful, turning our trauma into something that could protect other children. Mrs. Grayson had finished her jail sentence and was living quietly in another state. Thornton was in prison where he'd remained for years. Dr. Fleming had never worked in education again after his termination. The school district had new leadership and new policies, though I'd never fully trust them again. Trust, once broken by institutional failure, doesn't fully repair. On a Wednesday in May, I drove Lily to her final therapy appointment with Dr. Keegan. We sat in the waiting room together, and Lily looked at me with clear eyes and said, "Thank you for believing me when nobody else would. Thank you for fighting even when they tried to make you stop." I pulled her close and told her I'd always fight for her, that a father's job is protecting his child, even when that means going to war with institutions designed to protect their own interests over the vulnerable students they serve. We walked into Dr. Keegan's office together, and I watched my daughter speak about her recovery with strength that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. The panic attacks that school counselor dismissed as attention-seeking drama had been real trauma responses to real assault, and my daughter had earned every bit of her healing through courage I couldn't fathom. She'd come forward, testified, endured, and survived. 5 girls who'd been silenced found their voices because she'd refused to stay quiet. Justice came slowly, imperfectly, but it came. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.